Hi, it's a pleasure to have you here. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. The sun was setting when the phone rang, casting long golden shadows across the floor. I answered, expecting a soft hello, but instead I heard Melissa's cold, indifferent voice. "We're leaving tomorrow. Your beach house and your car have already been sold. Bye." She hung up without giving me time to breathe. My heart stilled as if someone had pressed a dagger against it, not from a stranger, but from the daughter I raised with my own hands. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, hoping she'd call back, say it was a joke, anything, but silence followed. How could she sound so calm while ripping my world apart? The beach house was mine, the car bought with years of labor and sacrifice. But to her, they were just assets, pieces of a life she had already discarded. I sat down slowly, numb, as if the walls themselves had turned on me. How had I raised someone so heartless? Every birthday cake, every sleepless night, every scar on my hands from cleaning other people's homes, all of it flashed before my eyes. Melissa had once called me her hero. And now she was taking everything I had ever built. No explanation, no conversation, just a goodbye wrapped in betrayal. I looked out the window, but even the sea looked different now, colder, more distant. My pulse raced, but no tears came. There wasn't time for grief, only the weight of truth. I was no longer her mother in her eyes. I was just an obstacle in the way of her ambition. After my husband died, I dedicated myself completely to Melissa. I gave up dreams, pleasures, and rest just to see her smile. I worked long shifts at a hospital cafeteria, cleaned houses on weekends, and sewed dresses at night. There were days I didn't eat so she could have what she needed for school. And through it all, I never once asked for gratitude, only love, only honesty. That beach house wasn't luxury, it was my hope, my future, my only escape from a life of struggle. Every nail hammered, every floor tile laid, was a whisper of freedom I thought I'd one day enjoy. But Melissa saw none of that. She had taken it all and tossed it aside like a used napkin. I remembered her laughter echoing through those rooms when she was a child, her little feet running across the sand. I remembered promising myself that one day she'd inherit it, but only when I was gone. That was the deal I made with destiny. But she couldn't wait. My health had declined, yes, but I was still breathing. Still alive. And yet she decided to bury me in silence before I had even drawn my final breath. The years I gave her were erased with one selfish decision. It was not just a betrayal, it was erasure, a theft of memory, love, and dignity. I once told Melissa that the house and the car would be hers someday. I never thought she'd take that as an invitation to claim them while I was still alive. She twisted my words into permission and dressed her theft in the costume of inevitability. Her husband Brian, a man with a smile as fake as plastic flowers, encouraged it. He found the buyers, falsified the paperwork, and even forged my signature on legal documents. To them, it wasn't theft, it was strategy. And while they were forging a new future, I was sitting alone in my kitchen, wondering where I had gone wrong. They acted like a team of vultures circling a carcass not yet cold. Melissa had told the buyers I was senile, ill, no longer competent to make decisions. The lies were layered, calculated, and cruel. And the worst part? She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. Not once did she consider calling to ask how I was doing, if I needed anything, if I was okay. She believed she had already won. But what she didn't know was that I had sensed this darkness in her long before. And I had already taken steps to protect what little was left of me. The beach house, the car, and even the future she thought was hers, would soon become her greatest regret. My fingers trembled as I dialed her number again, but my voice came out steady. "You forgot something," I told her, calmly. She paused, then scoffed, "What are you talking about now?" I chuckled bitterly, knowing I held the only real power left. What she had done wasn't just heartless, it was reckless. And I was ready to let her fall into the trap she set for me. She assumed I would beg or cry, but instead I gave her silence followed by truth. "You never asked who owns the house now," I said. "Because it's not me. And it's definitely not you." Her silence stretched, broken only by shallow breathing. For the first time I sensed fear in her. A crack in her arrogance that filled me with painful satisfaction. Weeks before her betrayal, I had grown suspicious. Melissa had become unusually curious about legal documents, asking strange questions about the house. My instincts screamed, and after all I'd survived, I had learned to trust them. I met with my lawyer in secret and transferred everything to a private trust, one she had no access to. The house, the car, even my bank account, locked and protected. It wasn't revenge, it was survival. I had no proof then, only a mother's intuition. But now that decision was saving me from total ruin. My lawyer assured me everything was airtight, Melissa's forged sale would fall apart quickly. What she thought was a clever heist was nothing but a paper fantasy. And soon, reality would collapse over her like a tidal wave. Melissa and Brian celebrated their victory with champagne and plans for a new life. But they didn't know the documents were useless, the signatures invalid, the ownership legally sealed in a trust. The buyers had been duped, and once the dust settled, lawsuits would follow. She had stolen nothing but time, and time was running out fast. Her dream was already crumbling beneath her. They believed they had outsmarted an old, weak woman, but I was neither. The buyers began to question the deal, contacting their lawyers, uncovering discrepancies. I remained silent, letting the truth surface on its own. Justice, slow but relentless, was moving closer. And Melissa, so confident and cold, was about to discover just how wrong she had been. In the quiet corners of my life, pain had begun to settle like dust. I kept my illness hidden, not out of pride, but because I didn't want Melissa to carry that burden. It was easier to suffer in silence than to ask for a love that had long grown cold. The fatigue, the dizziness, the weight loss, they came like whispers at first, then roared louder each day. I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd notice the change in my voice or the way I walked slower. But Melissa never once asked how I was feeling, she only asked about what was in my name. The betrayal hurt more because I knew I wouldn't have much time left. I had hoped for peace, for soft mornings by the ocean and warm nights watching the stars. Instead, I was watching my daughter destroy what little beauty remained. My illness wasn't my enemy anymore, she was. The pain in my body couldn't compare to the pain of being erased. I had given her my life, and she watched me wither without flinching. It was in that silence that I truly understood, I was already dead to her. He showed up unexpectedly, wearing a nervous expression that didn't match the coastal calm around us. "Ma'am," he said cautiously, "your daughter told us you were incapacitated, that you couldn't speak or make decisions." I looked him in the eyes and handed over the legal documents, proof of the trust, my full mental capacity, and the deception. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, his face draining of color with every line he read. What had begun as a simple commission had turned into a legal nightmare. He had been part of something criminal, and now he knew it. I watched his facade crumble as he realized the sale was void and his license might be in danger. "I swear I didn't know," he stammered, sweat forming on his brow. "She said it was urgent, that you were sick and agreed to everything." I said nothing, only nodded slowly, letting the truth linger in the room like smoke. The agent left with shaking hands and a ruined reputation behind him. One more life caught in the storm Melissa had stirred. And for once, I didn't feel guilt, I felt vindicated. Melissa's call came late at night, her voice no longer calm but filled with rage. "How dare you trick me like this?" she shouted, as if I had stolen something from her. I held the phone, listening to her tantrum, her fury built on lies and entitlement. When she paused to breathe, I finally spoke. "You tried to take what wasn't yours. I protected myself because you gave me no choice. There was silence on the other end, but I could feel the heat of her humiliation even through the distance. Her plan had failed, and now she needed someone to blame. "You're my mother," she cried out, but there was no love in her voice, only frustration and disbelief that I had outsmarted her. I closed my eyes, remembering the girl I once raised, so full of laughter and innocence. That child was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. "Being your mother doesn't mean I have to let you destroy me," I said softly, the truth cutting sharper than any insult. She hung up, and I sat there in the darkness, not victorious, not bitter, just empty. There was nothing left between us but ashes. Brian arrived at my doorstep with his head down and his voice soft, as if humility could erase betrayal. He said they were confused, that the documents had been misunderstood, that they thought I had already passed ownership to Melissa years ago. I watched him, every word measured and desperate, trying to salvage what was already ashes. "We didn't mean harm," he claimed, eyes flickering like a liar caught in a storm. But I saw the truth behind his forced remorse. He never thought I'd fight back. To him, I was just an old woman too weak to matter. I let him speak, let him fill the air with excuses and polished regret, but I felt nothing but the hollow ache of disappointment. This wasn't a man protecting his family, this was a man trying to escape the consequences of greed. "You underestimated me," I said, my voice calm but cold, "and you're going to pay for that mistake." His face stiffened, pride wounded, mask cracking. The door between us had once opened with trust, now it was barely ajar with pity. And with one final look, I closed it for good. I contacted my lawyer the next morning and asked him to prepare the full case for the authorities. No more delays, no more protecting people who had used my silence against me. When Brian tried to sell the house with forged papers, he committed a crime. And Melissa, as his accomplice, would answer for her part too. I had all the evidence, legal documents, witness statements, even the real estate agent's confession. What they thought was hidden had been carefully documented and preserved. Brian and Melissa believed I was alone, but I had something they never counted on: patience and truth. I told my lawyer every detail, every suspicion, every moment of doubt that led me here. I refused to let sentiment weaken me again. This wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about justice. For every hour of sacrifice, every night I cried alone, every smile I faked to hold our family together. Now the truth would speak louder than the lies. They arrived like a storm, Melissa, Brian, and the so-called new owners, ready to reclaim something they never owned. But I was already there, standing tall with my lawyer by my side and 2 police officers stationed behind me. Melissa's face went pale the moment she saw me. She hadn't expected resistance, much less legal firepower. She began speaking rapidly, layering lies on top of confusion, playing the victim in a story she wrote herself. The officers didn't flinch, they had heard it all before. My lawyer calmly handed them the trust documents, proving the property was never theirs to sell. Melissa broke down, tears streaming as she begged the officers to believe she hadn't known. But it was too late for innocence. Brian stepped forward, trying to speak, but one officer raised his hand to silence him. "This isn't about emotion," he said. "This is about fraud." I stood in the doorway of the house I'd built with my bare hands, and for the first time I wasn't afraid. They hadn't just tried to take my home, they tried to erase my existence. And now, they would answer for it. The court filings moved faster than I had imagined, as if the universe itself had grown tired of silence. Melissa and Brian were formally charged with fraud, forgery, and attempted theft of property. Their perfect image in the community shattered like a dropped porcelain mask. Melissa begged me to withdraw the charges, her voice cracking with desperation, but her tears were years too late. "I'm your daughter," she cried, hoping blood would override justice. But daughters don't steal from their mothers and expect forgiveness to come wrapped in excuses. I didn't feel victorious, only weary from the weight of it all. I told her calmly, "I loved you once, more than anything. But love doesn't mean blind protection anymore. The judge had no sympathy for false innocence, and neither did I. Brian stood silent as their lawyer tried to minimize their roles, but the evidence was overwhelming. They would not go to prison, but their lives would change forever, reputation gone, financial ruin approaching, and a criminal record that would follow them for life. This wasn't revenge. It was consequence. That night, I sat alone and remembered the day I first brought Melissa to the beach house. She was 5, wearing a bright yellow dress, her little hands clutching a seashell she swore had magic inside. We laughed until the sun disappeared, and I told her this place would always be her haven. It had been our promise, our secret world built from nothing but dreams and salt water. She called me her hero that day, and I believed her with every beat of my heart. I had no idea that same heart would one day be broken by that same child. Back then, I worked extra shifts just to buy materials for the house, each nail and tile a testament of sacrifice. Melissa had once painted her name on the back porch in chalk, swearing she'd never leave me. Now that memory felt like a cruel joke carved into the foundation of everything I lost. I had believed love was enough to build a future. But love without respect becomes a weapon, and hers had cut deep. I realized then that my grief wasn't just about betrayal, it was about mourning the girl who once believed in magic and who now only believed in control. After all the legal battles and accusations, the house remained untouched, just as I left it. The buyers backed out immediately once the fraud was exposed, not wanting their names entangled in scandal. My lawyer handled the unraveling of the sale quietly, ensuring every trace of their scheme was erased from the property records. Melissa's fingerprints had been wiped clean, not out of mercy, but because they never belonged there. The house stood as a silent witness to everything that had happened, as if it refused to be part of the lie. It was still mine, standing strong in defiance of the storm. I walked through its rooms again, one by one, each step echoing with memories that cut like glass. The sun filtered through the windows, warm and golden, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. I placed my hand on the kitchen wall where Melissa once scribbled "I love you, Mama" in crayon, and I let the tears fall. Not for her, but for the innocence we both lost. This house had seen joy and betrayal, laughter and lies, but now it was a monument to survival. I wasn't just reclaiming my home, I was reclaiming myself. News traveled fast in our small coastal town, carried in whispers from market stalls to church pews. People who once praised Melissa for her beauty and charm now crossed the street to avoid her. The headlines didn't need to say her name, everyone already knew. She became the woman who tried to steal from her own mother, a betrayal that no one could explain away. Brian lost his job at the bank, and their friends disappeared like fog in morning sun. The perfect family they presented was gone, replaced by scandal and disgrace. At first, I avoided the town square, unsure of how people would see me. But then Helen, my neighbor, took my arm and said, "Walk proud. You have nothing to hide." I followed her lead, and slowly, heads began to nod in respect instead of pity. The town didn't judge me, they judged what Melissa had done. And that gave me strength. The truth, once buried under silence and shame, had finally taken its rightful place in the open. At night, the loneliness would return, heavy and familiar. I didn't cry for the house or the money, I cried for the daughter I thought I had. I had always feared losing her to the world, but I never imagined she'd choose to leave me for greed. Every photo, every birthday memory became a wound instead of a joy. I lay awake wondering where I failed, what I didn't teach, what I didn't see. And then I realized, it wasn't my failure, it was her choice. The betrayal from one's own blood cuts deeper than any lie from a stranger. Melissa had not only betrayed me, she had betrayed the woman who sacrificed everything for her. I gave her my best years, my youth, my health, and she returned it all with forged papers and empty apologies. My body felt weaker each day, but my spirit had hardened. I no longer begged for answers or comfort. I accepted the pain like an old companion and allowed it to teach me where love must end and dignity must begin. Helen became my unexpected salvation, appearing each day with fresh bread and a soft smile. She didn't ask questions or offer false hope, she simply sat beside me, letting her presence speak louder than words. We shared long afternoons by the window, watching the tide roll in like time-erasing footprints. She told me stories of her youth, her lost loves, her quiet heartbreaks, and I found myself laughing again, even if only for a moment. She reminded me that not all bonds are born from blood, some are forged in fire and pain. And hers felt like the family I had always deserved. Her kindness was simple, but it filled the void Melissa had left behind. When I fell ill one evening, Helen was the one who rushed me to the clinic, stayed through the night, and brought me home like I mattered. She never asked for anything in return, never judged, never questioned why I still kept Melissa's childhood drawings on my fridge. She understood something most people never did, that healing doesn't come from forgetting, but from being seen. And in her eyes, I was no longer a mother betrayed, I was a woman worth standing beside. Just when I thought the dust had settled, Melissa found a new way to twist the knife. She sent my grandsons to visit me, dressed in innocence, holding pictures and drawings from when they were babies. "Mommy says she's sorry," one of them whispered, eyes filled with confusion. I could see Melissa's strategy behind their soft voices, using them as shields, hoping I'd lower my defenses. It wasn't love that sent them, it was manipulation. And as much as I adored them, I knew I had to stand firm. I knelt down, kissed their cheeks, and handed them a note to give their mother. Inside, I wrote, "I love you more than anything, but I cannot save you from yourself." I looked at the boys and smiled through the ache, promising them they'd always have a place in my heart. But Melissa? She had chosen her path, and I was no longer walking it with her. Her tears, her apologies, her regret, it all came too late. My door remained closed, not out of hate, but out of survival. The strain of everything, stress, heartache, betrayal, had begun to wear me down. I collapsed one morning in the garden, the sky spinning above me, the air thick like smoke. At the hospital, the doctors whispered words I had feared, my condition was worsening, and there was little they could do. Melissa didn't visit, didn't call, didn't send a single message. But Helen was there, every hour, every test, every tear I shed behind a fragile smile. She held my hand like a daughter should have, and that gesture healed more than medicine ever could. As the days passed, I realized I was living on borrowed time. The anger that once kept me strong began to fade, replaced by a quiet acceptance. I didn't fear death, I feared dying with my heart still tied to a daughter who saw me as a burden. Helen told me stories to keep me awake, brought flowers from her yard, and reminded me what dignity looked like. In that hospital room, I wasn't abandoned, I was protected. And in that fragile space between breath and silence, I began to let go of what I could never fix. Lying in that hospital bed, I made a decision that had been haunting me for years. I asked Helen to call my lawyer, and together, we rewrote my will, this time with no room for sentiment or hesitation. Melissa would receive nothing, not out of revenge, but out of reason. Everything I owned, everything I built, would be placed in a trust for my grandsons. They wouldn't access it until they turned 30, far from their mother's influence, old enough to choose their own path. I included clear clauses to protect them from any interference. My lawyer looked at me with quiet respect, understanding the weight behind every signature. "You're doing the right thing," he said. And I believed him. It wasn't about punishment, it was about breaking the cycle. I had spent too long confusing love with sacrifice, letting guilt shape my choices. This will wasn't an ending, it was a beginning, one that would finally protect the legacy I nearly lost. And in that moment, I felt peace like I hadn't in years. A week after changing my will, I received a letter written in Melissa's delicate but sharp handwriting. It arrived without warning, folded perfectly inside a pink envelope that smelled of her old perfume, familiar, yet now unsettling. I opened it with trembling hands, half hopeful, half dreading what she might say. But it wasn't an apology, it was a list of excuses, blame, and half-truths twisted into justifications. She wrote about pressure, about fear, about how she thought I didn't trust her enough, as if that excused betrayal. There wasn't a single "I'm sorry," only a bitter tone masked by flowery words. I read it once and felt my pulse tighten, my breath grow shallow. This wasn't a bridge, it was a dagger dipped in nostalgia. She wanted me to feel guilty again, to question the decision I made from a hospital bed. But I folded the letter without another glance and lit a match to it, watching the words vanish into ash. That chapter was closed, sealed by fire and clarity. Melissa still didn't understand that what she destroyed wasn't material, it was sacred. And sacred things, once broken, don't return the same. After the letter, I knew I couldn't stay in the beach house much longer. Though it was safe and legally mine, it had become a museum of memories I no longer wished to relive. I contacted a trusted real estate agent, one who knew the full story, and listed the house for sale, quietly, without announcement. I wasn't running away, I was letting go. The ocean had once brought peace, but now it whispered betrayal with every wave. I needed silence that healed, not silence that reminded me of what was taken. I found a small home inland, closer to Helen and her family, a simple place with a garden and wide windows that welcomed light. Moving day came with no fanfare, no tears, just the steady rhythm of acceptance. I left behind the sea, the porch, the broken chalk lines from Melissa's childhood. In this new place, I was unknown, untouched by scandal, free to breathe without glancing over my shoulder. For the first time in years, I woke up and didn't feel the weight of a haunted past. It wasn't about forgetting, it was about finally choosing peace. My new home wasn't grand, but it was mine in the truest sense. Helen helped me paint the walls, pick out curtains, and fill the shelves with new books instead of old memories. Her grandchildren visited often, calling me Nana without hesitation, as if I'd always been part of their story. Their laughter filled the rooms with a joy I hadn't felt in years, one untouched by bloodlines or history. I tended the garden each morning, my hands in the earth, my soul finally steady. Here, I wasn't someone's mother, someone's victim, I was simply myself. Evenings were filled with soft music, warm tea, and long talks with Helen about life, love, and the scars we carried. We found comfort in each other's presence, two women who had survived more than we ever admitted. I kept a photo of Melissa and the boys tucked away, not out of bitterness, but because it belonged to another life. This chapter wasn't about revenge or justice, it was about breath, stillness, and freedom. And in that quiet, I found something I thought I'd lost forever, peace that didn't ask me to earn it. The trial didn't last long, but the damage had already been done. Melissa was sentenced to community service, her name forever linked to a public record of fraud and betrayal. Brian lost his job and couldn't find work in the region, so they were forced to move to a distant city where no one knew their shame. The illusion of their perfect life had been shattered beyond repair, and their new beginning tasted like exile. She tried once more to call, but I didn't answer. Some doors, once slammed, are never meant to reopen. People in town no longer spoke of Melissa with admiration, they spoke of her with pity or disdain. She became a cautionary tale mothers whispered to their daughters when teaching them about greed and ingratitude. What she took from me, she never recovered in her own life. Her fall wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, slow, and permanent. That was the true punishment, living with the weight of what she had done. And I, far from her chaos, watched the horizon with no regrets. Years passed like a slow-moving tide, carrying distance but never erasing connection. One spring morning, I received 2 letters, written by hands I hadn't held since they were boys. My grandsons had grown, and in their own voices, they spoke of confusion, sorrow, and the pain of being used as weapons in a war they didn't understand. They didn't defend Melissa, they only asked if I still loved them. Their words were honest, not manipulated, filled with the ache of sons searching for truth. I read their letters with tears, not of sadness, but of longing finally answered. I responded with care, choosing every word like a stitch repairing fabric long torn. Yes, I still love you, I wrote. I never stopped. My silence was never rejection, it was protection. I told them about the trust, about the home that would one day be theirs if they chose to build lives different from their mothers. They deserved that chance, and I had waited years for the day they might ask for it. As I sealed the envelope, I whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for healing. Because love, even bruised, never truly dies. My garden became my temple, the soft soil beneath my feet more sacred than any cathedral. I spent my mornings tending roses and lavender, sipping tea on the porch, and listening to birds that didn't care about human heartbreak. There was peace and simplicity, in knowing that my life no longer belonged to lies, manipulation, or regret. I stopped measuring time by calendars and began measuring it in blooming petals and warm breezes. Each moment felt like a quiet rebellion against everything that had tried to break me. And in that silence, I finally felt whole. Though I still missed the daughter I once knew, I no longer waited for her return. The girl with pigtails and sandy feet had vanished long ago, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. My heart had stopped hoping, but it had never stopped beating with love, for my grandsons, for Helen, for the life I had rebuilt. I wasn't bitter, I was simply tired of illusions. And so I embraced each day as it came, grateful not for what I had lost, but for what I had finally reclaimed, myself. On a warm summer afternoon, the doorbell rang as I sat quietly in the garden, lost in the scent of blooming jasmine. When I opened the door, my grandson stood there, grown, handsome, eyes filled with something unspoken. They didn't bring excuses or explanations, only sunflowers and a hug that melted years of silence. "Happy birthday, Nana," the eldest said, his voice trembling with emotion. I invited them in, heart thudding, as if time itself had paused to allow this moment. We sat for hours, talking not about what was lost, but what still remained. They told me about their lives, their struggles, and how Melissa never stopped blaming others for her fall. But they had chosen a different path, one guided by truth, humility, and the values they remembered from childhood. They asked if they could visit again, and I said yes, not with hesitation, but with the calm certainty of love restored. That night, I cried, not for pain, but for healing I never thought possible. It wasn't redemption for Melissa, but it was a bridge rebuilt with her sons. And somehow, that was enough. As I sat alone one evening, watching the horizon kiss the earth in hues of amber and violet, my thoughts returned to that first phone call, the one that shattered me. I remembered her cold voice, the arrogance, the certainty that she had won. And I smiled. Because in the end, the house, the car, the trust, the legacy, none of it had been hers to steal. What she forgot was the soul behind it all, the woman who had lived, fought, and survived. I had been broken, yes, but not defeated. The laughter that escaped me wasn't bitter, it was full and clear, a sound that belonged to a woman who had taken back her story. I had outlived the storm, weathered every betrayal, and built a life that could not be rewritten by greed. Melissa took pieces of my past, but I kept my future. That day by the sea, when I said, "You forgot something," I meant it. She forgot that love without respect dies, and that strength, once awakened, cannot be silenced. And now, as the sun disappeared behind the hills, I laughed, for the last time, on my own terms. When my time finally came, it arrived gently, like a closing book with pages still warm from the reader's hands. There was no drama, no final confrontation, only peace, and the quiet hum of a life completed. I left behind a home filled with love, a garden still blooming, and a letter for each grandson tucked inside the legal trust. "You are not defined by your mother's choices," I wrote. "You are free to write your own story." My name would not echo in scandal, but in resilience, whispered by those who knew the truth. At the small memorial, Helen stood beside my favorite tree and read aloud my favorite poem, her voice steady, her eyes glistening with pride. The grandsons placed sunflowers at my grave, symbols of the summer I found them again. In time, they would tell their children of a woman who loved fiercely, lost deeply, and never gave up her soul. I was not just a mother or a victim, I was a survivor, a builder, a force. And long after the world forgot my face, the legacy I left would bloom like wildflowers in the wind. Not for glory, but for truth. In the months that followed my passing, Helen tended the garden as if I had never left. She watered the roses I once planted and trimmed the lavender with the same care I gave to my grandsons' futures. My rocking chair remained on the porch, untouched, facing the sunrise as if waiting for me to return. The neighbors often passed by, leaving sunflowers at the gate, a quiet sign of respect for a woman who had endured and risen. My absence was felt, but not mourned with despair, it was remembered with quiet gratitude. I hadn't left a void, I had left a light. My grandsons began visiting more frequently, sometimes just to sit under the tree where Helen had read my poem. They spoke of me with pride, not shame, and carried the weight of the past without letting it define them. One of them began studying law, inspired by the injustice I had overcome. The other worked with children, teaching them to speak up when something felt wrong. They were not echoes of their mother, they were redemption in motion. And that, above all, was my true victory. Melissa, meanwhile, faded from public memory. In a distant city, she lived a quiet life, free from scandal but heavy with the silence of being forgotten. She never remarried, never rebuilt what she destroyed, and never contacted my grandsons again. Her punishment was not in court sentences, but in the loneliness she created for herself. She had burned the bridge, and now she stood on an island of her own making. No one had to exile her, she exiled herself. One day, years later, she stood outside the garden gate. Helen, older but just as firm, saw her before the grandsons did. Melissa didn't step inside. She looked at the house, the flowers, the porch, and whispered something only the wind could hear. She left a small bouquet of white lilies by the fence, then turned and walked away. No note, no name, no demand. Just a final offering to the memory of the woman she once called May and no longer knew how to face. The lilies stayed there for days, untouched, slowly fading with the sun. No one moved them. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was an ending. An unspoken acknowledgement that some stories don't resolve, they settle. Helen said nothing to the boys, they didn't need to know. Some truths only belong to the wind, and that brief return was one of them. Melissa had returned not to be seen, but to grieve something too late to reclaim. Years passed, and the trust matured. On their 30th birthdays, the grandsons each received their part of the inheritance, clean, legal, protected. But they didn't spend it on luxuries. They bought homes for their families, funded education programs, and created scholarships in my name. My legacy didn't become gold, it became opportunity. I had feared the name Melissa would stain everything. But it didn't. It became a lesson, not a curse. In a small coastal museum, a section was later dedicated to local women who shaped the community through resilience. My picture was placed there, not because I asked for it, but because someone remembered. Below it, a plaque read, "She stood alone, but never bowed." She lost everything, except herself. Strangers would stop and stare at the photo of the older woman with silver hair and steady eyes. They didn't know the whole story, but they felt its weight. Helen passed away peacefully in her sleep years later, and she was buried under the tree we once sat beneath. My grandsons buried her with the same care she once gave me. On her tombstone, they engraved, "Chosen family is sometimes the truest kind." And beside her, a stone with my name remained, surrounded by wild sunflowers that grew without needing to be planted. It was not a graveyard, it was a garden of memory, blooming every spring with stories. Melissa was never mentioned again. Not out of spite, but out of peace. Her name no longer held power in our story. She had chosen absence over accountability, silence over healing. That was her ending, not ours. My grandsons grew old, told their children my story, not with bitterness, but with pride. They said, "She taught us that love is fierce, but boundaries are sacred." And in that, I lived on. And so, the woman once broken by betrayal was remembered not for how she suffered, but for how she rose. My story was not one of revenge, it was one of reclamation. I left this world not with wealth, but with wisdom etched into those I touched. A house was lost, but a home was built. A daughter was gone, but truth remained. And in the echo of every nana spoken by a child I never met, my soul smiled. Because I did not disappear. I endured,